The Sabbath is an interesting law that divides Christians who live on this side of the cross. Okay, the Sabbath, like the other 9 commandments, are given by God to the people of Israel so that they will live in obedience to God's word. However, unlike the other commandments that govern how we live today, keeping the Sabbath is one that comes under scrutiny. And today we'll see why. On Monday, we looked at Jesus' statement about fasting and his discussion or kind of expression about the bridegroom. And what we saw was that Jesus used this phrase to declare that he is the long-awaited Christ. Okay, well, today we pick up the narrative with Jesus challenging those previously held beliefs that people had. Mark chapter 2, verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Okay, so the issue for the Pharisees is not so much that Jesus is picking grain, it's that he's doing it on the Sabbath. Because according to the Pharisees, you're not allowed to reap, harvest, or thresh on the Sabbath. Okay, all of which Jesus is accused of doing. And so Jesus responds, Mark chapter 2, verse 25. "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" Now, Jesus refers to David because the situations are similar. Okay, both involve a leader and their followers. Both involve food. Both involve the leader doing something which is said to be unlawful. Now, in David's situation, we're not sure if it's the Sabbath, but that's kind of irrelevant for the argument that Jesus is making, because his declaration is that if it's good for David, then it must be all right for me. Now, I hear my mother saying, "If your friend jumped off the harbour bridge, would you?" But of course, that's Jesus' point. David did what the Pharisees would say is unlawful, and yet the Bible never says that what he did was wrong. In fact, by Jesus referring to David, it tells us that what David did was right. And the assumption among the Pharisees is that what David did was acceptable. Okay, and so Jesus uses David as the example to say the same thing, which is that eating the grain on the Sabbath is acceptable. After all, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, God commands us to take a day off because he rested, and so should we. Okay, God gives us a Sabbath for our own good, because otherwise we would work ourselves into the ground. But more than that, the Sabbath is an opportunity for us to put work aside and focus our worship and thoughts on God. Okay, that's why Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for you. Okay, the Sabbath is there so that you will rest, so that you will take time for yourself, so that you will spend time with your family, so that you will spend time with God. That's why we have the Sabbath. Okay, it's interesting that in the book of Hosea, God says if his people continue to sin without repenting, then he will remove the Sabbath from them. He will take away their rest. Now, I imagine then the Sabbath will become very important to the people of God. Friends, with that in mind, why don't you take a minute to consider what you think about the Sabbath and when you actively hold to a Sabbath rest. Okay, whether you do it or you don't, I want you to justify why that is from the Bible. And then spend another minute pondering what it means that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. And then pray and ask God to help guide you in terms of what you should do when it comes to the Sabbath.